Hello and Assalamu alaikum. Did you know that the conflict between Iran and Israel is one of the most dangerous and complex geopolitical tensions in the world today? It has the potential to escalate into a major global crisis. But how did we get here? And more importantly, where do we go from here? Welcome to today's video. We will break down the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel, two nations locked in decades of hostility. We will take a deep dive into the history, explore the current state of affairs, and discuss the potential future outcomes. Whether you are interested in global politics, in the Middle East, or just want to understand why this conflict matters to you, this video has got you covered. I am Saeed Salat and I've spent years studying and analyzing geopolitical conflicts. Today, I'm going to help you understand this complex issue in a way that's easy to follow and will give you the insights you need to grasp why this conflict is crucial for the world's stability. Now let's dive into it. The historical background. To truly understand the conflict between Iran and Israel, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time when these two countries weren't always enemies. Surprisingly, they were once allies. So how did two nations that used to cooperate end up locked in a bitter struggle that has lasted for decades? Iran and Israel before 1979. Let's rewind to the period before 1979. Iran under the rule of the Shah was actually one of the Israel's closest allies in the Middle East. The two countries shared mutual interests, chief among them their opposition to Arab nationalism, which was spreading across the region. At the time, many Arab states refused to recognize Israel and saw its existence as illegitimate. Iran, on the other hand, recognized Israel and even engaged in trade and military cooperation with it. For instance, Israel helped modernize Iran's military and Iran supplied Israel with oil. This was a relationship of convenience, driven by common threats rather than ideology. But everything changed in 1979. This year marked the Islamic Revolution in Iran, where the Shah was overthrown, replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini and his clerical regime. With the revolution came a radical shift in Iran's foreign policy. Khomeini, a staunch critic of Israel, labeled it a Zionist regime and an enemy of Islam. From this moment forward, Iran's foreign policy towards Israel became one of the fierce opposition. The revolution transformed Iran from a secular monarchy into a Islamic republic, which not only altered its internal politics but also its view of the broader world. Israel, now seen as an illegitimate occupier of Palestine land, became one of the Iran's primary enemies. Khomeini's regime vowed to support the Palestinian cause, and Iran began backing militant groups that were committed to Israel's destruction, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. This brings us to the rise of proxy wars, which have been defining feature of the Iran-Israel conflict for decades. Rather than fighting directly, Iran has armed, funded and trained groups that attack Israel. Hezbollah in particular has grown into one of the most powerful non-state actors in the Middle East, thanks to Iran's support. Hezbollah has been involved in multiple conflicts with Israel, including the 2006 Lebanon War, where they launched thousands of rockets into Israeli cities. This indirect form of warfare allows Iran to challenge Israel without risking a direct military confrontation. And for Israel, Hezbollah and Hamas pose a constant threat along its northern and southern borders. So while Iran and Israel have never fought a conventional war against each other, their rivalry plays out through these proxy battles, which continue to destabilize the region. But how has this long-standing conflict shaped the current tensions we see today? And what role does Iran's nuclear ambitions play in it? Let's move on to the current situation to understand how this historical enmity has evolved. The hostility between Iran and Israel today is more intense than ever. From proxy wars to cyber attacks and the looming threat of nuclear weapons, the conflict has reached new levels of complexity. But what exactly is happening right now? And why is the situation so volatile? One of the biggest drivers of tension between Iran and Israel is Iran's nuclear program. Iran insists that its nuclear activities are for peaceful purposes, like generating electricity and medical research. However, Israel and much of the international community believes Iran is secretly developing nuclear weapons. The prospect of a nuclear armed Iran is a nightmare scenario for Israel and his allies. Israel views Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat. After all, Iran's leaders have repeatedly called for the destruction of the Israeli state. If Iran were to obtain nuclear weapons, it could fundamentally change the balance of power in the Middle East and make any conflict far more dangerous. Israel has made it clear that it will do whatever is necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear capabilities, even if that means military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. In fact, over the past decade, Israel has already launched covert operations to sabotage Iran's nuclear efforts. These include cyber attacks like the famous Stuxnet virus, which disrupted Iran's nuclear centrifuge and targeted assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. While these actions have slowed Iran's progress, they haven't stopped it. And as Iran continues to enrich uranium, tensions keep rising. Beyond the nuclear issue, Iran and Israel are still deeply entrenched in a proxy war. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, armed and funded by Iran, remains a powerful force. In fact, Hezbollah now possesses an arsenal of over 100,000 rockets and missiles, many of which are capable of reaching deep into Israeli territory. This gives Iran significant leverage as Hezbollah could be used to launch attacks on Israel in response to any confrontation. But the battleground extends far beyond Lebanon. In Syria, for example, Iran has established a strong military presence. Over the past decade, Iranian forces, along with militias it controls, have been supporting the Assad regime in Syria's civil war. Israel has responded with hundreds of airstrikes on Iranian targets in Syria, aiming to prevent Iran from establishing a permanent military foothold there. These airstrikes have intensified in recent years as Israel tries to push Iran out of Syria altogether. In Gaza, Iran provides support to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, groups that frequently clash with Israel. While these groups may not pose the same level of threat as Hezbollah, they still create constant instability and force Israel to maintain a high level of military readiness along its borders. The conflict is not just military, there is also an economic and cyber front. The US sanctions on Iran, which have crippled the Iranian economy, are widely seen as part of a broader strategy to weaken Iran's ability to finance its proxies and develop its nuclear program. Israel has been a key advocate for these sanctions, pushing the US and the Europe to maintain pressure on Iran. Cyber warfare has also been a significant component of the conflict. Both Israel and Iran have launched cyber attacks against each other in recent years. Iran has targeted Israeli infrastructure, including power grids and water systems, while Israel has retaliated with attacks on Iranian ports and oil facilities. These cyber skirmishes are part of a broader shadowy conflict that remains largely invisible to the public, but can have serious consequences if it escalates. Another key factor shaping the current situation is the US withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action JCPOA in 2018. This deal, signed in 2015, was meant to limit Iranians' nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. However, when the US under President Trump pulled out of the agreement and reimposed sanctions, it dramatically increased tensions. Iran, in response, began violating the terms of the agreement, accelerating its uranium enrichment and pushing its nuclear program closer to weapons grade levels. Israel has been a vocal opponent of the JCPOA from the start, arguing that it didn't go far enough to prevent Iran from eventually developing nuclear weapons. With the collapse of the deal, the international community is now left scrambling to find a new diplomatic solution, while Iran continues to expand its nuclear capabilities. This ongoing conflict began between Iran and Israel has significant implications for the broader Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which view Iran as a threat to their own security, have grown closer to Israel in recent years. This has led to the signing of the Abraham Accords in 2020, where several Arab nations normalized relationships with Israel. These shifting alliances have further isolated Iran and could lead to a regional coalition aimed at countering the influences. Meanwhile, the Iranian public is suffering under the weight of economic sanctions, with inflation skyrocketing and shortage of basic goods become more common. The Iranian government, however, shows no sign of backing down, and the threat of conflict remains ever present. So where does this leave us? The Iran-Israel conflict has only grown more complex, with both countries engaging in a multifaceted struggle that spans military, economic, and cyber realm. The next logical question is, what could the future hold for this volatile relationship? Let's explore that in the next section. The conflict between Iran and Israel isn't just a regional issue, it's a global concern. The stakes are high not only for the Middle East but for the entire world, as the involvement of major powers like the United States, Russia, China, and Europe adds layers of complexity. So, how is this conflict affecting the world, and what role do these major players have in shaping its outcome? The Iran Israel conflict is a major flashpoint that could easily ignite a broader regional war with global consequences. A direct confrontation between these two nations could pull in neighboring countries and even disrupt global oil supplies. The Middle East, after all, is a critical region for the global economy. The Straits of Hormuz, which Iran controls, is a choke point for around 20% of the world's oil exports. Any escalation that threatens this waterway could send shockwaves through energy markets, driving up prices and triggering a global economic crisis. But the conflict is not just about oil, it also affects the broader security landscape. Iran's support for Hezbollah and other militant groups destabilizes Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza, creating hotbeds of conflict that can spill over into other regions. Meanwhile, Israel's constant need to defend itself, particularly from rocket attacks, has led to cycles of military responses that fuel further instability. This constant state of tension between Israel and Iran also distracts from other pressing global issues, from climate change to international terrorism. The world's focus on this conflict means that diplomatic and economic resources are continuously being diverted to contain it, while other challenges are left unresolved. The United States has been a central player in this conflict for decades. As Israel's strongest ally, the US has provided billions of dollars in military aid and cutting edge technology to help Israel defend itself. American support extends beyond defense, with the US often acting as Israel's advocate on the global stage, particularly at the United Nations. However, the US also has a complicated relationship with Iran. Since the 1979 revolution, the US has imposed harsh sanctions on Iran and sought to limit its influence in the region. This has led to a long-standing policy of containment aimed at preventing Iran from becoming a dominant power in the Middle East. The US withdrawal from the JCPOA under President Trump only deepened the divide. And while the Biden administration has made attempts to revive negotiations, tension remain high. The US faces a delicate balancing act. On one hand, it must ensure Israel's security. On the other, it needs to avoid a direct military conflict with Iran, which could draw in other powers and destabilize the entire region. The US also has to consider its relationships with other regional allies like Saudi Arabia, who see Iran as their main rival. Any shift in American policy could upset the fragile balance of power in the Middle East. Russia, meanwhile, plays a different game. Unlike the US, Russia maintains good relations with both Iran and Israel. In Syria, Russia and Iran have been allies in supporting the Assad's regime. Russia's military presence in Syria has helped Assad regain control of much of the country, while Iranian forces and and militias have done much of the ground fighting. This has created a strategic alliance between Moscow and Tehran. At the same time, Russia has a close relationship with Israel. Russian President Vladimir Putin has worked to maintain open lines of communication with Israeli leaders. And the two countries coordinate militarily to avoid clashes in Syria, where Israel frequently carries out airstrikes against Iranian targets. This puts Russia in a unique position. It can act as a mediator, but it also benefits from the instability which keeps the US bogged down in the region. Russia's goal is to expand its influence in the Middle East while ensuring that no single power, whether it's the US or Iran, gains too much control. By playing both sides, Russia strengthens its role as a key power broker in the region. China's role in the Iran-Israel conflict is more subtle but growing. As part of its Belt and Road Initiative, China has been expanding its economic and political ties across the Middle East, including with both Iran and Israel. China sees Iran as a critical partner for its energy needs and as a key player in its effort to expand influence in the region. China has also signed major economic agreements with Iran, including a 25 years strategic partnership that involves billions of dollars in investments. This gives China leverage in Iran, but it also means that Beijing has a vested interest in ensuring that the conflict doesn't escalate to the point where it disrupts global trade, especially oil supplies. However, China's relationship with Israel is also very important. Israel's advanced technology sector has attracted significant Chinese investment, and the two countries have cooperated on a range of tech and infrastructure projects. Like Russia, China tries to balance its interests in both countries, avoiding taking sides but quietly expanding its influence. Europe has been a key player in efforts to resolve the nuclear standoff with Iran. The European Union was instrumental in brokering the 2015 nuclear deal, and European leaders have consistently advocated for diplomatic solutions over military ones. Europe, particularly France, Germany, and the UK, has pushed for a return to the JCPOA as a way to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. However, Europe's influence is limited. Without the full support of the US, European efforts to bring Iran back to the negotiating table have stalled. Meanwhile, European nations are also wary of alienating Israel, which views the JCPOA with deep suspicion. Europe's role, therefore, is largely diplomatic, pushing for dialogue and sanctions relief in exchange for nuclear concessions, while trying to keep both sides engaged. As you can see, the global stakes in the Iran-Israel conflict are incredibly high, and the involvement of major powers like the US, Russia, China, and Europe only adds more complexity. So what does the future hold, and how we can move towards a peaceful resolution? That's what we'll explore next. With so many complexities surrounding the Iran-Israel conflict, from regional dynamics to global power plays, the question remains, where do we go from here? What are the possible outcomes? And more importantly, is there a viable path to peace? In this section, we will explore several potential futures for the Iran-Israeli conflict and discuss the solutions that could help bring stability to the region. Let's consider scenario 1. One potential outcome is the continuation of the current trend, a cycle of proxy wars, covert operations, and periodic flare-ups between Iran and Israel. If this continues, the region will face ongoing instability, with both countries engaging in tit-for-tat strikes, cyber attacks, and diplomatic hostilities. In the worst case scenario, this could lead to a full-scale war. Should Iran or its proxies in Lebanon or Syria launch a major attack on Israel, or if Israel decides to strike Iran's nuclear facilities preemptively, it could trigger a broader regional conflict. This would undoubtedly involve Hezbollah, Hamas, and possibly even other nations. The economic and human cost would be catastrophic, not just the Middle East, but for the entire world, as global oil markets would be disrupted and millions could be displaced. This scenario is highly undesirable, but it's not off the table if the status quo persists and diplomatic efforts fail. Both sides are heavily armed, deeply distrustful, and entrenched in their positions. Without a shift in strategy, continued military escalation seems all too possible. Let's talk about now scenario number 2. Another possibility is that the conflict settles into a prolonged diplomatic stalemate. This is where things remain tense but not violent. Iran might continue its nuclear ambitions while Israel remains on high alert. But both sides could avoid direct confrontation for fear of the consequences. The nuclear issue, however, would still hang like a dark cloud over the region. Iran's slow but steady progress in its nuclear program, coupled with international sanctions, would likely continue. Israel, feeling concerned, would maintain its policy of military preparedness, possibly even launching limited strikes to disrupt Iranian efforts. In this scenario, the international community, including the US, Europe, Russia, and China, would keep trying to manage the conflict diplomatically. However, without genuine breakthroughs, this scenario essentially becomes a frozen conflict, one that simmers beneath the surface without reaching a resolution. It's a situation where tension never truly fades and the region remains fragile and volatile. Scenario number 3. On a more hopeful note, a diplomatic solution, while challenging, is not impossible. The most feasible pathway to this is a combination of multilateral negotiations, sanctions relief, and a reworking of the nuclear agreement. A revised JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, could provide Iran with much needed economic relief in exchange for verifiable limits on its nuclear activities. This could reduce tensions with Israel, which would feel less threatened by the prospect of a nuclear armed Iran. For this to happen, Iran would need to agree to stringent inspections and restrictions on its nuclear program, while Israel might need to moderate its military response to Iranian activities in Syria and Lebanon. The US with European support, would likely lead the charge in these negotiations, backed by the promise of gradual sanctions itself. Russia and China, both having ties to Iran, could also play constructive roles by encouraging Tehran to compromise in exchange for economic partnerships and investments. This diplomatic route would require all parties to make difficult concessions. Israel would need assurances that Iran's nuclear program is truly peaceful, while Iran would need to trust that the West and its allies will respect its sovereignty and provide lasting economic reliefs. It's a tall order, but it's the only pathway to a lasting peace. Now let's talk about scenario number 4. The most optimistic outcome, though still distant, is a scenario where Iran and Israel, perhaps through back-channel talks, begin to engage in regional peace efforts. It's important to remember that Israel has successfully normalized relations with several Arab nations through the Abraham Accords, showing that peace is possible even with historical adversaries. If Iran and Israel could find a way to at least coexist peacefully, the entire Middle East could benefit from economic cooperation. Both nations have highly advanced technology, and an easing of tensions could lead to shared projects in fields like water technology, energy, and agriculture. In this scenario, Iran would reintegrate into a global economy using its vast natural resources to foster development, while Israel could expand its regional influence through partnership rather than conflict. While this may sound like a far-fetched dream, given the current climate, it's worth noting that unexpected breakthroughs in diplomacy have happened before in the Middle East. However, achieving this level of peace would require a complete paradigm shift, a willingness by both sides to prioritize the future over the past. The international community has a vital role to play in shaping these outcomes. The US must continue to support Israel's security while pursuing dialogue with Iran, aiming to avoid direct conflict. Europe, with its experience in diplomacy, can act as a mediator, helping both sides find common grounds. Russia and China, with their unique relationships with Iran, must use their influence to press for moderation and compromise. All major powers need to recognize that their involvement is critical in preventing a broader conflict. If they can encourage Israel and Iran to choose diplomacy over violence, they can help stabilize the Middle East and by extension the world. The optimal solution to the Iran-Israel conflict isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, but a multi-layered strategy combining diplomacy, economic incentives, and security guarantees. The reintroduction of a stronger, more comprehensive nuclear deal, coupled with gradual economic relief for Iran, could ease tensions. At the same time, security cooperation with Israel must remain firm to ensure its defense. The more the international community can bring both Iran and Israel to the negotiation table, perhaps through neutral mediators like the UN, the better the chance of a peaceful outcome. It's not easy, and the history of mistrust will be a hurdle. But if all sides can focus on the future rather than remain trapped by the past, peace is within reach. The path to peace in the Iran-Israel conflict is long and complicated, but it's not impossible. While escalation and conflict remain possible outcomes, diplomacy and compromise offer the best chance for stability. The role of major powers like the US, Russia, China, and Europe is critical in steering the region towards a more peaceful future. The question remains, will they rise to the challenge? To recap, the Iran-Israel conflict is one of the most critical and dangerous rivalries in the world today. It has deep historical roots, is driven by modern-day nuclear and proxy conflicts, and has the potential to impact the entire globe. While the future is uncertain, there are paths to de-escalation if global leaders are willing to act. At the heart of this conflict is the need for balance, balancing security concerns with diplomacy, and balancing the interests of regional powers with global stability. What do you think? Can diplomacy prevail, or are we heading towards more conflict? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Till then, take care, bye bye, and Allah Hafiz.